Good morning or good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our very first ESG webinar in our new ESG webinar series. So today we're starting with an all-important question around, so what is the process? And we would like to demystify the ESG process. So welcome to this very first one, and we hope you find it very informative and that you'll join us for the whole series. I have with me Ashley Bleeker, who will be presenting these ESG webinars with me. So hello, Ashley.
Hi, Letta. Good morning, everyone. Afternoon, maybe, depending on where you are.
Yes, definitely morning in Perth. Definitely morning for our guys here in Melbourne, but hopefully we've got a few people from New Zealand as well, and they're in the afternoon already. So lovely to have you here. So you would have seen we've scheduled a series of 6 ESG or sustainability webinars. Starting today up to August, we look at the ESG process. So today is demystifying the process holistically. Then we look at frameworks, we look at stakeholder engagement, materiality assessments in May. We then look at, how do you measure to manage this whole sustainability reporting? In July, how do we pull it together to deliver our ESG report? And then finally, the question, in August, we'll get some of our audit and assurance partners to join us on, do we need assurance? When do we need assurance? What would it look like, or what would a roadmap to assurance over your ESG report look like? So a series of 6, and we hope you can join us for all of those. A bit of a recap. In February, as part of our IFRS and corporate reporting webinars, we looked at what is the business problem. So we want to go back to that and we want to recap. So if you were part of our IFRS and corporate reporting webinars, we would have talked about this. For you, we recap. For those people who join us for the first time here at BDO, at our webinars, and especially this ESG webinar, what is the business problem that we're trying to solve here? So the problem is that stakeholders are demanding greater transparency from entities about their long-term sustainability or their ESG impact. And when we look at those stakeholders, it ranges from investors right through to regulators. So investors, our lenders, or a donor in a not-for-profit context, our customers throughout the supply chain. So it's not just customers, it's also suppliers, employees, and regulators. The other thing that's interesting is this business problem is not limited to the top end of town. The business problem is not only for the ASX 200, it's for all listed entities, it's for all corporates, listed and unlisted, and it's also for not-for-profits. We know that our not-for-profit entities are competing with one another to attract funds from philanthropists and donors, and if they can demonstrate the impact they're having on the community and the fact that they're a sustainable organization, that would help them to attract those funds and raise funds. So stakeholders, broad stakeholders, demanding greater transparency. That's the problem we're dealing with. That's the starting point.
And I think, Aletta, and I don't know if you're happy for me to interrupt as we go, but I think the thing that's really interesting in the Australian context is normally you would expect the regulator box to be bigger in that than it is. But as many people will be aware, Australia doesn't really have any clear regulation at the moment around sustainability reporting and sustainability performance. There are various frameworks that people choose to report under for very, very valid reasons. And so one of the big issues that we have is ordinarily you would hope that the state or the government or a regulator would drive activity or behaviour in this space, which is what's happening much more in Europe and also in the US and elsewhere, not so much in Australia at the moment. And so one of the big challenges that for us at least, is there's a soup of related issues here, and trying to wrap your head around all the issues and how they all work together and how you prioritize issues, behavior, action, strategy, initiatives can be really confusing. And I suppose what we're trying to do is make this as simple as possible. And for us, we kind of like to talk about the business problem as effectively generating three major risks, notwithstanding the opportunities that ESG and sustainability commitments and reporting also generate. There are three big risks here, and they're all about access, right? So there'll be access to capital, access to markets, or access to people. And certain organisations will experience one or more of these in different ways. And so just to unpack what each of those are. So access to capital can be a big issue if you're used to tapping the capital markets for various reasons. Investors are pouring more money into sustainable funds, green bonds, things like that. Shareholder activists are more driven by sustainability issues today than ever before. Many of you would know who Larry Fink is, the CEO of BlackRock, one of the biggest and most powerful PE funds in the world. To manage his ego, Larry likes to write an annual letter to CEOs telling them what he thinks is important for the year coming up. He released his 2022 letter in January this year. He talks about a bunch of things, but this year he really focused on this whole idea of ESG and sustainability. He talks about stakeholder capitalism. That's capitalism driven by mutually beneficial relationships, not just between organizations and the market, but between the organization, its employees, its customers, its suppliers, the communities in which they operate to prosper. He talks about tectonic shifts of capital. He had some number in there around, sustainable investments are at $4 trillion. It doesn't matter what the number is, right? McKinsey released something earlier this year, quoted the number at $30 trillion. It doesn't matter what it is. The number is enormous. The amount of money that's being preferentially directed to sustainability and ESG issues and companies that have a better track record in those spaces is compelling. So that's the first issue, which is access to capital can become a problem if organisations don't commit to doing something in this space. There are a lot of organisations that are also heavily affected by their consumers or their clients, the market. The market is telling them to do something. So consumer products have a big issue, right? Coles and Woolworths are all over this because their customers are demanding that they demonstrate some kind of performance in and around sustainability as an organisation, not just for them as customers, but for the community more broadly. All other consumer products face this as well. For example, a lot of the beauty products that are available at the moment have been forced to really reconsider their supply chain and be forced to really reconsider their waste generation, and all the packaging that you get around, various products that you buy around personal hygiene and beauty has completely changed lately because consumers or purchasers of those products are demanding that those organisations be more responsible in the way that they package their products and that they manage their waste. The other really interesting thing too is even as a professional services firm, for us, we're getting more and more frequently asked about our ESG performance by prospective clients or current clients. And when we're tendering for pieces of work, we're being asked more and more to demonstrate our ESG performance. Aletta, I know that this is a real issue for you at the moment, just in relation to modern slavery. Do you want to just talk about what's happening for you right now?
Yeah, I think what's interesting here is, when we provide services to our clients, and clients have certain policies around modern slavery, as an example, there's an absolute requirement that we comply with those policies as well. And I cannot sign up that I'm complying with a client's policy, amazing policy that it is, unless we, BDO, have a similar policy and that we're tracking performance, we're measuring performance, otherwise it's an undue risk for our organization. I said to Ashley on Friday, I had a number of meetings with a number of clients who want to engage us to do amazing work, but we had to negotiate exactly what are these policies, what are the requirements of BDO. I had to go back and find out what are we exactly, can we meet it. So the lawyers were very happy for a whole Friday spent with lawyers and 3 or 4 clients during the day. So really important, you know, how this is going to be pushed down to all entities, whether you're the big end of town or not, whether you are looking to the capital, to the markets to raise capital, or whether you're looking to financiers to raise funds. If you want to provide services to your customers, you know, you'll have to do certain ESG aspects. And I'm finding that it's becoming more pervasive. So you have to do more and more things, and more people are asking for it. You know, sometimes it's a questionnaire. Please provide us feedback on exactly you're doing around diversity, for example. So organizations have to be on the front foot in order to keep customers.
Yeah, thank you. And the third bucket there is just access to people and access to talent. And this is a huge issue for various organizations at the moment. You ask CEOs or people in management what one of their big issues is, and they'll generally always say people. Particularly for us, we're a people business. It's acute, and it's a double whammy really in this space, because attracting and retaining talent is a big issue, and you know, the fact that the world's been locked down and mobility has been restricted hasn't helped that. But it's not only that, it's also that the people that we're trying to attract and retain are now placing a greater emphasis on the social license of their employer to operate, right? So what's their employer doing for the environment? What's their employer doing for staff? What's their employer doing for the communities in which they operate? More importantly, what are they doing for marginalized and disadvantaged people around the world? You know, all these types of things matter more to the people that we're trying to attract and retain. And so these 3 buckets are really the key risks that organizations face if they don't commit to doing something in and around ESG or sustainability reporting.
So in our view, the solution is a holistic communication. You know, it's holistic measurement and communication, I could add. So we are saying, if we've got all these stakeholders, our own people, our customers, investors, regulators, etc. Previously, we've given them audited financial statements in accordance with accounting standards, and that had to satisfy their information needs. Going forward, there's additional information required that are not captured by my beloved IFRSs, and therefore a need to also prepare ESG sustainability reports that go with those financial statements. At this moment in Australia, voluntary prepared ESG sustainability report, so it's driven by stakeholders, it's driven by demand. It's not a compliance exercise, and the fact that it's driven by stakeholders, whoever they may be, means there's value in these ESG and sustainability reports. It's not just to tick a box. It's not just for compliance, and I know compliance is important, and I accept that. However, here we're talking about something that is providing to be really valuable because it's demanded by our stakeholders, and therefore so many entities are voluntarily moving there. The other thing that's interesting that I just want to flag here is financial statements usually audited. Sitting next to it going forward would be these ESG sustainability reports, and one would imagine for them to sit next to each other on par, one would imagine that at some stage one would require some level of assurance, maybe not audit, some level of assurance over these sustainability reports. Now, we're not there yet, but I think, you know, we can just already read the tea leaves that that is what will be required going forward. So absolutely, the effort we put in to prepare audited financial statements, sitting next to it, these ESG sustainability reports, that's absolutely speaking to our stakeholders, and therefore very valuable to organizations. So if we look at ESG and sustainability, you know, what is this all about? You know, it's shifting the focus from short-term financial reward to long-term stability. It is really trying to eliminate practices that harm people or the planet or compromise lives of future generations. So, I think everybody can look at this and say, this is what I want for my children, this is what I want for future generations, but also what I want for myself. I think really important. Maybe a personal story. We arrived in Australia just over 20 years ago now. Yes, I still sound like this. I'm sorry. My children sound like Australians, don't worry. But we've arrived here 20 years ago, and people often ask, why did you come? And I know a lot of South Africans would say we came for their children and the future of their children. And my husband and I, maybe we're selfish, but we've always said, absolutely, we came for the future of our children, the two we had then. And luckily we had some two Aussies as well afterwards. But we also came for ourselves. So I think we're not just doing this for future generations, but we're also doing for the people here today and the planet here today to have a better environment for all of us. So that's just maybe my reflection.
But it's palpable, right? I mean, not that we need to stress this point, but just the weather events on the eastern seaboard of Australia over the last 2 weeks have been absolutely horrific, and none of us want to live through floods, right? None of us want to have to clean up after something like that ever again. And so and we'll talk about this in a minute, right? We'll talk about climate change and net zero, but the reason that it's become one of the biggest and most pressing and most prolific ESG issues is because it's so real and palpable for people. If it's not a bushfire, or if it's not a flood, or if it's not a drought or something else, then it's really hard to make it real for people, and it's really hard to spur some people, some organisations into action. But I think that's why climate change is become the really, the number one kind of standout issue here, is because it affects so many people. Aletta, sorry, you go.
The other thing was, I try to tell a personal story around leaving South Africa and coming here. I think the other thing is around diversity and inclusion. I've got 3 daughters. So yes, I want better representation of females in the workforce and senior positions, etc., for myself, but also for my children. But I don't only want it for my daughters. I do believe that as a female individual, I can contribute already. So I think I just wanted to make the point that it's not just about the future. It is about changing the present to make the future better as well.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe a bit of a philosophical point for an IFRS,
no, that's all right.
Which is a bit scary.
Aletta, is now a good time just to do a quick straw poll and gauge
Yes.
from those listeners that we have what their level of kind of activity in their own organisations is around sustainability reporting?
Actually, I agree, because I think people are definitely sick and tired of listening to the two of us. It's only 20 minutes in, and I think we need a break from this South African accent.
So if everyone's happy just to complete that quick poll there, just so that we get a sense of, I suppose, the level of investment your organisation has made in this space. They're all sequential in terms of the amount of investment required, starting from nothing at the top. And our view would be that assurance over one or more reports is probably the highest level of commitment or investment that an organisation would make in this space today, at least anyway.
Yeah, and actually, we actually have people that tick that box, that they've obtained assurance over one or more of these reports, which is absolutely amazing. I think that is fantastic. I think we should reach out to them to also present with us on this webinar and share some tips and tricks, right? I think if they would be willing to, that would be amazing. Because not many people can tick that box, right? So that is fairly special.
You can tell that Aletta and I haven't necessarily rehearsed who's going to be speaking when here, because we're talking over the top of each other. But we were just talking to a prospect a couple of weeks ago that's been issuing sustainability reports, very detailed ones, very heavily researched and measured for, I think, 10 or 11 years, and only now is looking to provide assurance over those sustainability reports. It's not uncommon for people to be producing incredibly compelling, well-researched sustainability reports without actually having produced assurance over them.
I've just closed the poll, Ashley, and you should be able to see the results now.
There we go.
So, yeah, so 43% of our attendees haven't started. 33% have made some inroads, some working on their first report, which is amazing. A number of people that has already produced a few reports, but no assurance. And we do have some people that's actually obtained assurance. So I definitely, we have to tap them on the shoulder to help us. That would be amazing.
But interestingly, so over 70% of people haven't produced a report yet, which is great to know, because that means there's a huge amount of opportunity here, and hopefully the demystifying conversation is helpful for those people that are looking to do something in this space.
Correct. So the next slide, we're asking the question, what could be communicated in ESG and sustainability reports? You know, we framed this question like this very deliberately. It's not what should be communicated, because it is very different for every organization. There's no standard set of rules, and it's not because there are so many frameworks, and we'll talk about that in another session. There are a lot of frameworks, but that's not really the problem. Even if there was only one framework in the world, every organization will have to look at themselves and reach out to their shareholders and assess and stakeholders and assess what is important to their stakeholders, what is important to them, which of those items that are important to both their stakeholders and them do they have the ability to influence. And then those would be the things that one would potentially measure if they're measurable, and potentially communicate in these sustainability reports. So it's not a one size fit all. You cannot get a template or a pro forma. It's really about your organization, your stakeholders. So it's an individualized, or would we say a personalized approach that we have. So if we look at, I said to Ashley, let's put the elephant in the room right there, right up front. Let's talk about climate change. If we say what could be in the sustainability report, climate change could be there, but it's not necessarily that it will be in each and every report. And this goes for all the ESG factors. Climate change is the one that has a lot of prominence at the moment as a result of COP26, as a result of floods and all those things we're currently seeing in Australia as well. So let's talk a little bit about climate change. I think what's important is to look at not really the start, but where we started to get some momentum, and that was in 2015, the Paris Agreement. Now that Paris Agreement was a legally binding international treaty on climate change. So it was developed by 196 parties at COP21 in Paris. And then, you know, it was all about the goal of this Paris Agreement was to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, actually preferably below 1.5 degrees Celsius, compared to pre-industrial levels. So this was really a landmark event around climate change. So a lot of countries signed up to this Paris Agreement, 196 in 2015. Fast forward to 2021, November 2021. And in November 21, we have COP26 in Glasgow. And at COP26, it's all about climate change. There's a new international sustainability standards board being announced. and a number of entities sign up to quite firm commitments around climate change. And the whole concept of net zero, very prominent. So, you know, so what is net zero? A lot of people ask what is net zero? So net zero really just means cutting greenhouse gas emissions to as close as possible to zero, and then with any remaining emissions reabsorbed from the atmosphere by oceans and forests, for example. So why is net zero so important? Because that's really one of the key takeaways from COP26. You know, science shows that to avert the worst impacts of climate change and preserve a livable planet, global temperature increase needs to be limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And that's the real focus. The question is, how can net zero be achieved? So this is one of the biggest challenges we face. And I think what's important, it requires a complete transformation of how we produce, how we consume, and how we move about. So, you know, net zero is really throughout the world. Most organizations impacted by it, and a real focus. And a question that people are asking at the moment is, by when will you be net zero? So is it by 2030? Is it by 2050? And I think the latest when you should be net zero is 2050. Important though to say here, to make a public statement that we will be net zero by a particular year should be backed up by an actual program and a plan and a strategy on how we get to net zero by that particular year. And that often is the challenge. If you look at the United Nations website, there's a very interesting bit of history. I love history. For all my sins, I love history. The road to net zero, you know, starting at 2015, what was agreed at the Paris Agreement, what happened last year, what's expected to happen by 2030, and then ultimately, how do we get to 2050, where we achieve net zero? I think 2030 is the one that's a bit scary, where we need a 45% reduction in greenhouse emissions by 2030 in order to get to net zero by 2050. You know, looking at that, I thought that was scary. But, you know, I would highly recommend that United Nations website. Looking at all of this, I was also thinking, okay, what does net zero mean for us in Australia? And I was researching a bit and found the Australian government website of the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. And here in particular, and this was updated in November last year after COP26, where we saw our Prime Minister make certain commitments. And here it's about we will achieve zero emissions by 2050 in a practical, responsible way that will take advantage of new economic opportunities while continuing to serve our traditional markets. So trying to get that balance between economic opportunities and traditional markets. So, you know, we've got this plan, and I've got a link there to the plan, drive down the cost of low emissions technologies. So we're looking for innovation. Ashley, and I know you're passionate about innovation. So how can we drive down the cost of low emissions technologies? How do we deploy these technologies at scale? Because usually that drives down cost. How do we help our regional industries and communities seize economic opportunities in new and traditional markets? And how do we work with other countries on the technologies that are needed? So again, some really interesting information on an Australian perspective on net zero. Ashley, I'll hand over to you to carbon mitigation hierarchy.
Thanks, Aletta. And I mean, there'll be people that probably know more about this than I do, but the interesting thing about the Australian government's commitment to net zero by 2050, it was criticised for a couple of reasons, but one of the main ones is that it relied on technological innovations that didn't exist yet. And so there are a lot of assumptions made around reduction pathways without actually knowing what they were. So let's hope that innovation continues to thrive in this space, because we may be in a bit of trouble hitting our targets if we don't. What is really interesting for us, though, is when people think about net zero and how to get to net zero, it's not kind of an even playing field in terms of all of the options available to you. People talk about this kind of carbon mitigation hierarchy: avoid, reduce, replace, offset. And the idea being that some of these things are more favorable for obvious reasons than others. And so the starting point always for this kind of stuff is avoidance. Yeah, so the best way to reduce emissions is to avoid creating them in the first place, obviously. So these are activities that can be stopped with no or minimal impact on the business. And interestingly, they are also they typically involve avoiding cost, and so they're highly cost effective for a business. And so these are things like the classic one at the moment is avoiding travel, and many of us didn't really have much of a choice over the last couple of years anyway. And so we've done a lot less business related travel and done a lot more teleconference or video conference meetings. The other obvious ones are turning off electrical devices when they're not in use, and a lot of systems already do that for us. The other, another thing here is in relation to travel, which is encouraging staff to travel between home and work in ways that are more environmentally friendly. I don't know if everywhere is the same as Melbourne, but in Melbourne at the moment, there are electric scooters popping up absolutely everywhere, and there's just been an explosion of people riding around on electric scooters. So perhaps encouraging people, rather than driving internal combustion engine fueled vehicles around, to encourage them to ride bikes and or electric scooters to work, maybe fueled by renewable energy, of course. The second one in the hierarchy is reduce. So how can you make unavoidable activities less emissions intensive? Can you introduce more efficient technologies in the way that you do things? So again, classic is, can you move to energy efficient LED lighting in an office? Many of us have already done that in our homes as well. Can you reduce the amount of waste that you send to landfill? Can you partner with service providers, for example, that are actually introducing efficiencies into their own operations? So what are some examples? If you do a lot of catering, can you partner with a catering supplier that has efficient ways of managing waste reduction? If you do a lot of copying and printing, perhaps many of us don't actually do any printing anymore, can you partner with a photocopying or printing provider that has efficient ways of doing business and delivering their services? If you're a technology organization that stores a lot of data in the cloud, can you partner with data centers in a way where the data centers run more efficiently? And we all know how much power data centers use. So there's a real push on at the moment for data centers to be efficient in how they store and process data as well. So there's a lot of opportunities there. The next one is replace. So how do we replace emissions by transitioning to renewable energy sources? So the classics are here. What can we do around solar? What can we do around wind? And what can we do around hydro? There's a lot of installations of solar on buildings, and so that's a very real opportunity for specific businesses to be able to install their own generation there. And then it also looks at technology improvements that are driving the kind of electrification of various things. And this is the transition away from fossil fuels over the long term. So how do we electrify systems and processes in buildings more? They typically have big, ugly diesel generators in them. Transport's the big one, right? How do we turn fleets of transport vehicles into electric powered vehicles rather than diesel powered vehicles? So that's just not just you and I buying a Tesla. That's Linfox changing all of its diesel trucks into electric trucks. And then the last one, some people would say the poor cousin to all of this is purchasing offsets to deal with any residual emissions that you've got left over. And what we're seeing is a lot of organisations and a lot of businesses commit to net zero programs by 2050 to be consistent with the government's approach, by 2030 earlier if they can. And what we're not sure of is how much of this actually involves purchasing offsets to just pay for the problem to go away effectively. That's a very crude characterization. But The issue that we have here at the moment, particularly in Australia, so you can purchase offsets in Australia or you can purchase them internationally. To purchase the Australian carbon credit units, they are getting more and more expensive because demand is significantly outstripping supply. So in the last 12 to 15 months, they've more than tripled in price. So at the start of last year, they were $15 a tonne. They're anywhere between $45 and $50 a tonne at the moment. And our ability as a country to generate offsets isn't moving as quickly as our ability to commit to purchasing offsets. So just to think about this in a very specific way. So because the Australian government's committed to net zero by 2050, most Australian government instrumentalities are also doing likewise, right? Take local government organisations. So across Australia, there's more than 500 local government organisations, each of which presumably will commit to a net zero target at some point, if they haven't already. So you've got 500 local councils or local shires looking to purchase offsets in a market that already has a significant number of corporates looking to buy those offsets as well. And so, there are forward curves for a lot of this stuff about the price of these units and their tradability into the future. But the reality is, it's going to be a very expensive exercise for a lot of organisations, particularly corporates, that are making commitments around net zero, but haven't actually worked out how they're going to achieve those commitments. So if they think that their offset purchases are the panacea to all of their problems, I think they're going to be pleasantly or unpleasantly surprised by the cost required to solve the problem that way, if they can actually get the offsets at all.
Thank you, Ashley. So, the question we asked here is what could be included in a sustainability report, and all the things we've talked about around commitments to net zero and how we're tracking around those commitments and how we're using electric vehicles and how we are, no longer traveling for business, but maybe using video conferencing, etc. All of that could be included in sustainability reports. However, the point we want to also make is climate change. If you look here, we've got 24 ESG factors on this particular slide, and climate change is one of the 24, and it's one of the 8 that we've highlighted around environment, around the E. So we've come up with the 8 ones we see most often around environment, 8 around social, 8 around governance. So climate change is one part, and it's a very important part, and it's very high profile at the moment and big momentum as a result of COP26, but it is only one part. There's 23 other big areas that one could say is up for grabs, and that could potentially be included in a sustainability report. That's the one point I want to make. The other point I want to make is, please don't think that you need to include in your sustainability report all 24 that you see on this slide. Remember, the overarching principle would be that every organization would have a look at stakeholders. What are they interested in? What would they like to see in a sustainability report? An organization would think, what is important for us? What would we like to communicate to stakeholders? What do we have an influence over, so we could actually move the dial and therefore show how we have made a difference? What can we measure and include in a sustainability report? So it doesn't have to be everything, but I think a balanced representation is often what we see. Often entities look at all of this and find that it's not just about climate change. They also include something around the social factors, something around governance factors, because ultimately their stakeholders want to see a balance. Ashley, did you want to flag maybe a few ones that are that we see a lot? I mean, the one that
Sure.
I flagged earlier is around diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is really important. Diversity, not just gender diversity, but also how do we include people maybe with disabilities in an organization and give equal opportunities. So I absolutely believe in equal opportunity for everybody. And, you know, how do we achieve that and what work do we do around that? Employee engagement, obviously very important. We said ESG, there's a business problem around access to people. And once we have people that work for us, we would like to know how engaged they are with the organization and what we do. You know, so at BDO, we have regular feedback and surveys with our employees and their levels of engagement and what they want to see at BDO. So employee engagement is really important. You know, if we look at human rights you know, how do we deal with that within an organization? Customer satisfaction. If you're a BDO client, you know that we often reach out to our customers and ask, what do you think about our service? And that's important to us. You know, community engagement. So it's not just for not-for-profits, but for all organizations. How do we interact in the community where we operate? So we've got a plant in a regional area. You know, how do we provide work for the community? How do we invest in the community? How do we promote, you know, if there are people in the community who you want to get involved, study further, how do we help them to do that? Do we help with recreational activities? Do we sponsor the cricket club, stuff like that? So that's a number of the social ones. Obviously, governance is really important. You know, do we have a board that represents diversity, but also diverse skills? You know, ethical behavior. Modern slavery is the one that I'm seeing a lot in the supply chain. So, you know, question being asked, what do BDO do around modern slavery? Ashley, I'll throw over to you for a few.
Yeah, no problem. And I think, I mean, you've already touched on some of the big ones, Aletta, and maybe as we go through examples, it might be a better way to run through this. But I mean, in governance, so a big one's obviously modern slavery. You're specifically impacted by that right now with some of your negotiations with potential clients. Bribery and corruption is a big one for organisations, particularly if they're we see a lot of this around organisations that hold financial services licenses. The great thing is about AFSLs is there's a very specific and prescriptive reporting regime that's required to hold a license anyway. So a lot of those issues are already being dealt with. But remuneration and executive compensation is a really interesting one that's very topical right at the moment. There's been a couple of announcements over the last few weeks or even few months where major organisations, Salesforce, for example, and a few others are now linking executive remuneration to overall ESG performance of the organisation. So their long-term incentives are absolutely aligned to the chosen ESG priorities for various of those organisations, which is really, really powerful when you think about it, because the way to drive genuine change within an organisation is to drive it from the top. And so if the senior management of a business is starting to be rewarded for specific behaviour, long-term behaviour, then that's going to have a huge impact on the way the organisation operates in the short, medium and long term.
Ashley, so we've put together a number of examples for all our webinar attendees of ESG and sustainability reporting that we've seen. And as you've said, you know, this will flush out some of those ESG factors. So it's not just about climate change, a lot of other things that are currently included in these reports. You will see we've tagged all of these examples as being social or governance or environment. And we've also put in where we found it. So this is a CBRE CSR report. So we'll step through a few of these. Ashley, in the interest of time, I reckon we'll have to go fairly fast, but everybody have access to it. Because, you know, I think it's really important that we get to our process at the end.
Yeah, sure.
So this is
Yeah, so these are, so just to be clear, these are just screenshots, right, out of various reports. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands of reports available for people to look at. These are some of the ones that, for various reasons, we've looked at recently that we think provide either good, bad, or indifferent examples. They're either heavy on numbers, or they're heavy on words, or they mix the two together. And all we're trying to do is give you a flavour of some of the things that people choose to report on, and how they choose to frame the reporting of that, right? And so we've specifically chosen some not obvious examples just to show you what some people are doing in and around this space. So this one's a reconciliation action plan, and starting with that one because it's a really strange beast for people that haven't had to deal with this before. And we've actually got questions from clients over the last 3 to 6 months saying, should we have a reconciliation action plan? And our really helpful answer is it depends. And then we have a conversation after that. But here's just one example. This CBRE has decided that a RAP, a reconciliation action plan, is a key pillar of its diversity, equity and inclusion strategy. It's got 3 pillars here to drive activity. You can see greater economic empowerment, encouraging a more inclusive workforce, providing immersive opportunities. The thing that's really interesting here is that they kicked off one particular initiative in 2019 called this Indigenous Centre of Excellence, which is really cool. That's the one on the right-hand side there. So this is connecting high-performing Indigenous organisations with opportunities within and across their own business. So where they have supplier contracts that they're looking to let out, they'll always invite one of these organisations to tender as part of that process. And so this is a really positive step in creating opportunities for Indigenous organisations. So this is just there isn't a whole lot of data that sits behind this, but it's a really cool way of addressing this issue. And there'll be other examples of this as well. Okay, so this one is another example of a social issue. This one's more around employee engagement. So this is Charter Hall. There's 2 objectives here. One is around customer experience. The second one is around employee experience. We really like the format of the Charter Hall. This is the summary of their sustainability report, but the summary has the objective on the left, you can see. Then it's got the current achievements, in this case, FY21 year, and it talks about what they've done. And it provides you with both qualitative descriptions of what they've done, but also quantitative descriptions where they have numbers or data to support things. Then the other thing that's really cool about this format is it talks about what they want to do in the future. So it has a short-term target for next financial year, current financial year, and then it has an even longer-term target as well. And so if you look at here just on people, which is the bottom row, you can see they talk about their employee engagement. They talk about being employer of choice. They talk about the extent to which they support LGBT plus networks, and they have a couple of rankings that they have in there to support it. And they also talk about female participation in their workforce, including on the board, in senior management positions, and in the workforce more broadly. They then set themselves goals for next year or this year to do it, and then even longer term goals as well. So just a really simple but really effective and really comprehensive way to demonstrate your current performance and your future ambition in relation to a specific target.
So in this example, this is an example from the NAB annual review. Again, you can see they've got a focus around colleague capability and well-being. So employees, so they look at cultural inclusion, LGBTI inclusion, they look at accessibility, you know, people with disabilities, they look at supporting colleagues who are carers, and if we look at the aging population, so it's not just carers of children, but also carers of elderly parents, etc. Supporting colleagues to work flexibly. And then the last one, diversity in the supply chain. So this one, again, it touches on a few different angles and really interesting. And we're just trying to illustrate that, you know, there's not a one answer to this. There's a number of ideas, and it's actually linked often to what you currently have in place.
Another community participation one here. Again, what's really nice about this one is it looks at, visually represents the extent to which they've achieved what they set out to achieve. So take the third one in this line, progress the development of an Indigenous cultural awareness program. They don't have it as achieved, they have it as progressed. Again, they've submitted their reconciliation action plan to Reconciliation Australia for consultation. They're waiting to hear back. And then they also talk about their ongoing commitments and what they'll do in this space as well. And so for their RAP, they want to implement it across their business.
This one is another one from NAB. Now, I couldn't go past this one because when we talk about integrated or holistic communication, I saw in their annual review for 2021, there's a 2021 at a glance, and the top part is looking at key financial performance measures, all the normal ones. And then on the same page, it's a one-pager, there are other key performance measures. And if we look there, there's a strategic net promoter score. There's a colleague engagement score. The number of customers assisted experiencing financial hardship, the people leadership score. So I just thought this is a great example on how it's not just about key financial performance anymore. When we look at a glance 2021, look at all the things that make this page. I thought that's quite powerful.
And this is a really simple one on governance, not trying to do too much, but just report on the composition of the board. This is a US headquartered business. And so they report on age distribution, how old are our board members. They report on gender diversity, how many men and women and otherwise do we have. They report on cultural diversity. This happens a lot in the US. They always report on white, Hispanic, Asian and other compositions, whether it's workforce or board or otherwise. And then tenure as well. They look at how long the directors have been there for. Really simple way just to demonstrate some of the basic data around board composition.
This one is from BHP, and the reason I've taken this snapshot out of their report is it talks about sustainability governance. It talks about that they've established and the board established the sustainability committee. They also talk in the third paragraph that the sustainability committee guides the remuneration committee in setting a related scorecard targets, ESG related targets, and evaluating performance against those targets. In addition, the board's risk and audit committee assists the board in overseeing the risk management system and the risk management also around risk management around ESG. And then they have a BHP forum on corporate responsibility. So you can see what we're seeing in practice, and this is a really good example of that the board actually establishes a separate committee dealing with ESG or sustainability. Sometimes it's the responsibility of the audit and risk committee, often a link with the remuneration committee, but entities to think about how are they going to govern this. If it is a big business problem, which we think it is, how do the board make sure that they're on top of this and address this?
Yeah, and this is just around ethics, which is a big issue for many organisations. The question is, what do we do around ethics? In this case, this looks at the amount of ethics training that people participate in. They have a risk culture survey and how they perform on the risk culture survey. They've joined an ethical alliance. They have implemented a risk and compliance system, which I suspect many organisations have something similar to that. They just need to put it in a report. But I don't want to say too much more there. I'll let us keep moving through these, just conscious of time. Again, sorry, you go.
I was thinking maybe we can come back to these. I know most people will be leaving us at 12, so I just want to get to our process. You can look at these around modern slavery, waste generation, paper consumption, again, consumption. There's one from Coles on how they frame it around their why. We've got how they partner with Second Bite in order to provide food and make sure we don't waste food. Woolworths have a very interesting way of looking at a sustainability tree, which is about people, planet, and product. And then they also here clearly articulate, if you look at people, planet, product, what are the goals and to what extent they've achieved those goals, which to me is a really nice way to articulate that this is a process. We're not at the end yet. We're not going to get to the end ever. This will be an evolving process over time. Now, having said all of that, we said there are things, we know this is important, it's a business problem. We know there are a number of ESG factors to consider. We've talked about what could be included. We've given you some examples. It could be a bit overwhelming listening to all of that. So where do we start? Now, in our view, step one is to develop an ESG roadmap. And what do we mean by this? This is an example of an ESG roadmap. And in this roadmap, we've said, we've come up with 6 phases in our example. And we said phase 1 is you start with a current state assessment. So we establish the current state for ESG activities. And to do that is not a simple process. There's a number of aspects to it. So we conduct a desktop review of our current ESG strategies, initiatives. We look at the monitoring and the reporting systems. What policies and procedures do we already have in place? What metrics are we currently measuring or collecting that could be used? Now, the interesting thing in phase 1 is a lot of these things already exist in your organizations in a lot of different departments. However, it's to go back to all of those policies and procedures and look at it through a lens of ESG. Is this part of ESG? So the reason we gave you an overview of all the things we've seen in reports and all the factors to consider is you might be surprised of how many of these things are already embedded in your organization. And the only thing we need to do is go and do a current state assessment, pull it together, and articulate that. So, let's start that. What do you already have in play? And then we've got a phase 2 where we do a materiality assessment. Who are your stakeholders? What are their issues? What would they like to see? What can you influence? How do we engage with these stakeholders, etc. In stage 3 or phase 3, we develop an ESG strategy. So we really pull phases 1 and 2 together. Phase 1 is what we've been doing for a long time. We have it in place. But we've looked at it and we realized we didn't know it, but we were doing some amazing things that has an ESG link to it. In phase 2, we've spoken to stakeholders. We've done an analysis. We know what they're looking for. In phase 3, we compare the two. We say, phase 1, this is what we've got. Phase 2, this is what they want. Is there overlap? If there's not overlap, there's obviously a gap. So what are we going to do about that? So what do we have to supplement? What do we have to measure in addition? What policies and procedures do we need over and above what we already have in order to meet the needs of our stakeholders in phase 2? In phase 4, we look at a maturity assessment. So when we know exactly what stakeholders are wanting, and maybe we already doing work in that space. Again, we can look at gaps. How mature are we in the areas that they're looking for? And then in phase 5, we get to the actual sustainability report. The important phase, though, is phase 6, and that is the ongoing monitoring and improvement and the annual preparation of that sustainability report. But the end game is to monitor and improve every year, every year, every year. And there's no end to that. So absolutely, first step is for an organization to sit back and say, what is our roadmap? Where are we going to start? What is step 1? And often the way you do it is to think about where do we want to get to? So, we have to add a timeline to that roadmap. So I've said phase 5, a sustainability report. If we work back from that, if you want to issue a sustainability report on 30 September 22, together with your audited financial statements, how are you going to make that happen? End of September is not that far away. And then when we work back, as an example, I've said, okay, August and September, we work on the actual sustainability report that will go in the annual report with the financial statements. Let's say phase 4, the maturity assessment, therefore, we'll have to do in July. That means the ESG strategy linking phases 1 and 2 will have to happen in June. That means the materiality assessment, reaching out to stakeholders, is in May, which means the current state assessment would be April, which is basically now. So what we've tried to do is put together an example of what a roadmap could look like, overlay a timeline in order to get to a first sustainability report by 30 September 2022. Now you can see the problem here. We know to get to audited financial statements by end of September, it's a lot of hard work. And we know crunch time is July, August, September. And surprise, surprise, that is similar crunch time for sustainability reports. So we believe we have to leverage current activities. You know, we have to do a desktop review across our business of current policies, programs, practices, protocols. We have to look at what we're already monitoring and to what extent they are ESG related, to what extent it's important for our stakeholders, and look at what we currently report on. That phase one, absolutely, that's where we have to start. To round off the session, next steps, we thought to make this useful, we need next steps. So what we're trying to do with a series of webinars is we're looking at these phases of a roadmap. And out of those phases, we're trying to come up with 6 webinars to try and guide you through the process. Now, it's not a direct one-on-one relationship, but we're trying to say, through the 6 webinars, how can we empower you to address a roadmap and work through the phases 1 to 6. So if that's what we're trying to do, and if that's something you're interested in, we would suggest the next step, absolute to do, before the 12th of April, which is our next ESG webinar in this series, is to focus on phase 1, that current state assessment. So to conduct a desktop review of your current ESG strategies, your initiatives, and also your monitoring and reporting systems. And that you're ready on the 12th of November, the 12th of April, to talk about a next step. We've flagged that we might be talking about frameworks available and how that forms part of the broader materiality assessment and engagement with our stakeholders. Ashley, I think at this stage we had in mind we want to run a bit of a poll. I think, are you happy for us to still do that?
Yeah, I think if we just do it quickly, it'll be a good sense for us to work out what we think is important to different people. So these are just, this is not a definitive list, but these are just some of the key issues that we've seen pop up. We'd be interested to know from your perspective whether one or more of these issues appears to be more pressing in your organisation or your stakeholder group than any of the others.
Yeah, and I think, Ashley, that will inform us on, you know, for the rest of the webinars, maybe items to focus on.
Yeah.
If you wanted to put comments in the chat box or the question box of something that's maybe not listed here, please do so. You know, the reason we're doing these webinars is to be helpful and to empower and enable you. Therefore, we would really appreciate feedback on what we should discuss, what we should include, and what you would find helpful. So thank you very much for everybody that's contributing, that's voting, that's giving feedback, you know, for helping us shape the webinars as we go forward. I'll give a little bit of time for people to still think about this. I can still see voting happening, which is amazing. Ashley, I have to tell you, when I do voting in the IFRS and corporate reporting webinars, I just don't get this level of involvement.
Oh, really?
Which I suppose is an indication that ESG and sustainability is definitely hot.
Fantastic. People are passionate.
People are passionate. It's amazing. You know, I don't want to stop it because people are continuing to vote. It's amazing.
Yeah, that's good.
All right. Amazing. Thank you very much for everybody that's shared their views. And this is what we've got so far.
All right. Okay. Even split.
Yeah, it's amazing. You know, diversity and inclusion 49%. Wow. Net zero 41. Waste reduction 40. Customer community engagement 39. Absolutely. Supply chain governance. Amazing. Thank you very much for your feedback. That's really fantastic. We appreciate it and we value it. And then, so if you need assistance, obviously, please reach out to Ashley and I. But we have a financial reporting insights newsletter that is much more than just IFRS and accounting standards. We also include ESG and sustainability, so you can register to receive that every month. There's always some good stuff on ESG and sustainability. You can also go to our website and you'll see there is just a little bit of a list of all the articles we've written over the last 12 months around sustainability, and we'll continue to write. Some of them are in our corporate reporting insights newsletter, some of them are global publications which we'll make available, and then also webinars, of course. So there's a lot of resources that you can consult on, but you can also reach out, obviously, to Ashley and I to have a conversation. I think the key thing is to get started. The key thing is to come up with your roadmap and to put a timeline to it. If there's no timeline, no deadline, you know, this can go into the never, never very quickly, and we don't have that luxury. The market is demanding us to move. Our stakeholders are requiring, demanding action. So, Ashley, thank you very much for presenting the webinar with me. Thank you, everybody, for attending. You know, next time we'll try our very best to come in within the 60 minutes. But we hope you found it useful. We hope you find those examples useful, and happy to talk to you. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.